So Carolyn is going to speak for us next about the top plant species of concern for our 5 counties. So these are the species we're hoping you guys will learn to recognize and start to help us inventory, and then we hopefully can help you control.
So good morning, thank you for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people. Frequently when you plan these things out, bad weather happens or what have you, but the weather's beautiful today, so I'm really glad to see everyone here. As I mentioned, I'm the botanist for about half of the Manistee National Forest. So I'm responsible for managing invasives on about 250,000 acres. So I am very, very excited about this partnership that is forming with the North Country Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. The more eyes on the ground, the more we'll be able to catch invasives early before they can become a real problem. So this morning, as Vicki said, I'll be talking to you about the top 5 terrestrial invasive plant species that we're concerned about. The steering committee chose these species because we know that they're in our 5-county area, but they're still here in low enough numbers that it is very possible to contain them and keep them from really disrupting our native ecosystems. For me, the most important reason that we should be concerned about invasive species is because of their potential to disrupt our native plant and animal communities. We are really lucky that we live in an area with really beautiful habitats. We have that dune system along the Lake Michigan shoreline. We have beautiful woodlands, really lovely grasslands with all sorts of great wildflowers, and just incredible wetlands, rivers, lakes, stream habitat. We are really fortunate to live and work and recreate in such a beautiful area. And I really don't want our area to become something that looks like this, where you basically just have 1 or 2 species of plants that really only support a few species of insects and other wildlife habitat. Does anybody recognize what this plant is? This is kudzu. How many people know that we currently have it growing in Michigan? Wayne does, because he's heard me before, but we never thought that it would live this far north, but right now it's growing and reproducing in Invasive County. So this is one that is not on our top 5 list at the moment because it isn't that prevalent and that population is being controlled, so hopefully it won't spread and cause problems elsewhere. And this is not Invasive County, by the way. This is Georgia. But yeah, when you look at this picture, basically everything green that you see here is kudzu. I think it's very interesting that they mowed a path so that people can walk through it, but it's covered basically everything. All the trees that used to be there are now just supporting kudzu. And I really don't want the beautiful area that we have to start looking like this. So how do non-native invasive plants disrupt our native ecosystems? Well, basically by simplifying these very diverse plant communities down to essentially monocultures. You know, you might see 1 or 2 trees back there, but this is essentially a monoculture. When these non-native plants replace the native plants that used to be there, they also displace all of the organisms that rely on those plants. Most of our insects are actually very particular about what they eat. About 90% of our insect species are considered specialists because they only eat 1 or a couple different kinds of plants. Monarch butterflies are probably the most well-known example of one of our specialist insects because they only eat milkweeds. If the milkweeds are pushed out of that system, so are the monarch caterpillars. And this pattern happens for, as I said, 90% of our insect species. If their host plants or their food plants are pushed out of an area, so are they. So with our top 5 species that we chose to talk about today, they all have the potential to replace very diverse plant communities with monocultures. The first one I want to talk about is garlic mustard. So garlic mustard is an obligate biannual, which means that in the first year, it just puts up this basal rosette of leaves. And then the second year, they have to produce flowers. So in an area, you can find plants that are this tall flowering and plants that are this tall flowering. So it's one of those interesting species that you think, oh, I can go through and pull all these really nice tall plants really easily. And then you look closer and you have all these itty bitty tiny ones that are producing these flowers as well. So garlic mustard produces a lot of these little tiny white flowers, and like all the other members of the mustard family, they have 4 petals that are kind of in a cross or X formation. And then later in the spring and summer, they produce the seed pods that are also typical of the garlic mustards. I was asked also to talk about some of the species that were similar to these invasives to make sure that people aren't controlling or removing plants that we really want to stay. Violets are a wonderful host plant for a lot of different butterflies. For example, the fritillaries only feed on the violets. So we really want them left in the ecosystem and not pulled accidentally for garlic mustard. So with garlic mustard, with the first year plants, they have these nice, very rounded teeth, while the violets typically have much smaller, much pointier teeth. The garlic mustard also has more of a rounded shape, while the violets typically have more of a pointed tip, unless something's been chewing on them, and then they look rounded. But it's really easy to tell the difference if you are confused. If you just tear off a little bit of the leaf, it'll smell very garlicky for the garlic mustard, while the violets aren't going to have that garlicky smell. Garlic mustard is an interesting plant. It has a lot of adaptations for forming monocultures. One of them is that garlic mustard is allelopathic, which means that it produces toxins that or poisons that are toxic to other plants or prevents them from germinating. It also poisons the mycorrhizal fungi. Many of our native trees and native wildflowers, such as the trilliums, the orchids, lupins, etc., form very strong relationships with soil fungi. The fungi help the plants get nutrients and water. The fungi in turn get carbohydrates from the plants. If that the mycorrhizal fungi is poisoned, it makes their partnering plants more susceptible to drought, disease, insect damage, competition, etc. As I said, garlic mustard really has the potential to form a monoculture and really push out all the understory vegetation. But as you look at this photo, what else is missing? Foresters out there? You see maybe tree seedlings, shrubs, subcanopy, right? Because garlic mustard can prevent tree seedlings from germinating. In addition, deer don't eat garlic mustard, rabbits don't really eat garlic mustard, and they are forced to focus on the native plants that are remaining in that system. So the herbivory pressure on those remaining native plants really increases as these non-native plants move into the area. So in a typical forest, you would expect to find that canopy layer, the subcanopy layer, the shrub layer, the ground layer, with lots of different species in each of those layers. So when I see an area that looks like this, and I think about what uses all those different layers, it really concerns me. Songbirds, for example, typically nest in a particular layer of the canopy, or of the forest. So, for example, you would have black-burnian warblers nesting in the canopy layer. You would have red-eyed vireos in the subcanopy, rose-breasted grosbeaks in the shrub layer, and then ovenbirds in that ground layer, or the herbaceous layer. So when you get a forested area that looks like this, you typically don't find those species that would nest in the subcanopy or shrub layer. In addition to nesting in particular layers in the forest, songbirds tend to forage in particular layers of the forest as well, and not necessarily in the same layer that they nest in. Now, looking at this forest, the canopy layer looks like it's made up predominantly of native trees. But that ground layer is almost all garlic mustard. So what else would be there in lower numbers? What would you expect to be there in lower numbers? The insects. So in this case, ovenbirds, which also forage in the ground layer, probably are going to disappear from this woods as well. Insects are a particularly important food source for songbirds. About 96% of our land birds eat insects at some life stage. Even if the adults eat seeds, they feed their chicks insects because they're such a great source of protein. Caterpillars make up the largest part of that food source. And our native plants typically produce about 35 times more biomass of caterpillars than non-native plants. And caterpillars are the main food source that songbirds feed their chicks. So if you have an area where we become predominantly those non-native plants, you tend to have a problem with our songbirds as well. If you're a songbird looking for habitat, what are you going to choose? A landscape that's dominated by native plants or a landscape that's dominated by non-natives? I've probably heard that a lot of our songbirds are disappearing. I think that the influx of non-native plants is having a huge impact on that, just because they are invading our rural areas, our suburban areas, our urban areas, and our natural areas. The next species that I want to mention is Oriental bittersweet. This is kind of like the kudzu of the north to me. It doesn't grow nearly as fast as kudzu, but it covers everything. So this is a group of people that I had a few years ago that was spraying one of our infestations of Oriental bittersweet. And you can see that it's covered everything on the ground layer, everything on the shrub layer, and it's starting to climb up into these trees. There's actually a tree just off to the side that didn't quite make it in the picture, but it looked like it was alive, but it was all Oriental bittersweet. And it just forms these really dense infestations. It is a vining species, and it can form a really substantial vine. You can see how it's spiraling up the tree. And the vines don't take nutrients from the tree, but they can shade out all of the leaves, and the weight of the vines can actually snap off the top of the trees. So it can have a huge impact on our forests. It looks fairly similar to our Native American bittersweet, which is a really excellent source of food for songbirds and other species. They do look a little bit different. Unfortunately, the leaves are very similar and they can be very difficult to tell apart, especially when the vines are young. The leaves look almost identical. But as they get older, the Oriental bittersweet leaves tend to get a little more rounded, while the American bittersweet leaves tend to be more elongated and have a more elongated tip to them. But the biggest way you can tell the difference between the two is to look at the berries. With the American bittersweet, the berries are red and then have a covering that's about the same color, while Oriental bittersweet has the red berries with a yellow color, so it's a very distinctive difference. Oriental bittersweet is far more prolific at producing berries. You can see how they're all scattered throughout here, and that's because Oriental bittersweet will have clusters of berries in all of the leaf axils where the leaves meet the stem, while the American bittersweet has just the clusters of berries at the tips of the branches. So it might be hard to tell which one you have for most of the summer, but then later in summer it becomes very obvious which one you have. And unfortunately, the two can hybridize, and the offspring tends to be more aggressive like the Oriental bittersweet. Oriental bittersweet has been recommended for erosion control and also for wildlife habitat. It's been widely promoted for wildlife habitat. But unfortunately, like other non-natives, it really doesn't support insect populations, but it does produce a lot of berries, which birds love and spread all over the place. Unfortunately, those berries aren't very nutritious. So this is a graph of the average amount of different berries that hermit thrushes would need to eat every day during an average day of migration. So the 5 with the white writing are some of our very beneficial native shrubs: viburnums, Virginia creeper, Michigan holly, chokeberry, and then native roses. The 2 with the yellow writing are 2 non-native species that have been widely promoted for wildlife value: autumn olive and Oriental bittersweet. But unfortunately, they don't have as high of a nutritional value as these natives do. The hermit thrushes would need to eat far more of these berries to make up their daily requirements for nutritional value as well as energy. Okay, the next species, I cheated, I'm sorry, but I grouped 2 species under the category of buckthorn. So 2 of the buckthorns that are moving into our area are glossy buckthorn and common buckthorn. Unfortunately, we do not have many instances of the common buckthorn in our area, but there are quite a few instances of glossy buckthorn, and we're finding it more and more frequently. The more people look, the more we're finding it. So common buckthorn can also form those really dense stands. It's a very prolific species. It doesn't take very long to really take over an area. They have determined that, especially with some of the more mature stands, that they counted the number of seedlings underneath those shrubs, and it could be as many as 100 per square meter, which is just amazing. So you can see that someone did a lot of really hard work. We took out a lot of those buckthorns, but then underneath are all those seedlings, which is why it's so important to catch this species before it really becomes established, because those seeds can stay good in the seed bank for up to 6 years. So if you have a common buckthorn infestation, it's really important to catch it early, but also to plan on treating it for at least 6 or 7 years. Oh, another interesting thing about buckthorn, the fact that it does produce so many berries and was so well promoted for wildlife habitat, is that the berries actually have a laxative effect. So even though the birds eat lots of them, they don't get much nutritional benefit out of them. So common buckthorn has these more elliptical shaped leaves, small yellow flowers. Probably the easiest way to identify them is to start looking for them in September, October, November, because they have these very distinctive, really dark black or really dark purple berries that stay on the shrubs through December and even later. So it's much easier to find them in winter than it is most other times of the year. Bless you. Let's see. It does have very interesting bark. It's kind of scaly bark. It can kind of look like a wild cherry or a wild plum tree, but the fruit is much different. They also have these little thorns off the sides of the branches, which makes them a real pain to try to rip out of an area. Glossy buckthorn is not nearly as aggressive as the common buckthorn, but it is still quite capable of forming a monoculture in an understory. And it can really form a dense shade that helps shade out all the other plants. They estimated that only about 50% of the sunlight that would normally reach the forest floor would reach it in a dense infestation. So it has the potential to really shade out those native species. It also has these very distinctive purple-black berries. Unfortunately, they do not persist like in the common buckthorn, but it has these really shiny leaves that have a very distinct veination on them. You can see it on the underside of that leaf. And even the seedlings have that really well-defined venation, which makes it quite a bit easier to notice when you're walking through the woods. And it also looks like some of the wild plums or wild cherries. You can see the one there. And an easy way is just to strip off a little bit of the bark and look for that very distinctive yellow to orange inner layer of the bark. Now, this is the one buckhorn we found on the National Forest so far. And you can see that I scraped off the bark just to make sure, because it just looked so odd there. But it was actually very easy to kill. We just injected it with some glyphosate, and it died before it produced any berries or produced any seedlings, so we lucked out. The fourth species I want to talk about is Japanese knotweed. Some people call Japanese knotweed Michigan bamboo, just because it grows so quickly. It has this hollow stem, and it does look quite a bit like bamboo. It's been widely planted as an ornamental or as a hedgerow, and for erosion control, it does form an incredible root system. The roots can go 6 feet down into the ground and spread out 65 feet from the parent plant. And it also produces these underground rhizomes, which are essentially branches or stems. And each node of the stem can produce a new plant, which is why it can produce or create such a really dense thicket so quickly. Unfortunately, that means that when you're controlling it, if you're digging it up and you leave those nodes in the ground or you dispose of them improperly, they can grow new plants. So this is one that you really have to be careful of how you control it. And what we found is to use herbicide, and I like to make sure that it's dead before I start cutting it down or anything, to make sure that I don't spread those nodes around.
What herbicide are you using?
Glyphosate. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup or Rodeo.
Foliar application or?
I used a JK injection tool, so it injected right into the stem. So I'm trying to keep track of my time.
Can you just spray it though?
You could foliar spray it also. And that's worked for small infestations, but you know they grow fairly tall, so it's one of those safety concerns. Just with wind direction.
But you injected 1 million stalks, or you just inject one in the plant heads? the whole thing?
You have to inject each of the stalks. So, yeah, it can, if you have a large infestation, it's a real problem. If you want to get into the details of control, we can talk about it after the meeting, but I only have, or after, maybe in one of the breaks or lunch, because I only have about 5 minutes left. So, in Europe, Japanese knotweed has apparently caused even more problems than it causes here, since it made the front page of the Sunday Times. And if you go on the internet, they have all sorts of photos of the Japanese knotweed growing into people's houses, through brick walls, through parking lots. It's really impressive. And it is a really difficult plant to kill. Okay, the last plant that I want to talk about is Phragmites. Phragmites invades the shorelines of streams, rivers, lakes, ponds, and wetlands. It is, from my perspective, one of the plants that I'm most worried about in our riparian and aquatic habitats. It isn't an actual aquatic plant, but a terrestrial plant. It grows incredibly densely. It grows so densely that songbirds don't actually nest in the middle of it. They'll just nest on the edges of it. It's been here for 300 plus years. In that time, only about 5 of our native insects have adapted to being able to eat it. In Europe, there are about 170 species of insects that typically feed on it, and they actually have horticultural programs devoted to trying to figure out how to propagate it and keep it alive. It doesn't have that problem here because it doesn't have the insect predators that it does there. Because it inhabits the shorelines, it just basically eliminates the nesting habitat for shorebirds. Some of the early studies are showing that it also degrades spawning habitat for fish. The more we're finding out about this plant, the more interesting it is. When you look under these dense stands of Phragmites, you'll notice that there are no plants growing around it. And there's usually also a blank edge around them. That's because the root system secretes an acid that dissolves the roots of other plants. And I haven't seen any studies or research on it yet, but it would be really interesting to find out what impact that acid is having on other organisms. The benthic macroinvertebrates, amphibians, minnows, etc. This plant also has the potential to have a huge impact on recreation in our area. In our area, we're so dependent on people coming up to fish and canoe and kayak and what have you. Can you imagine trying to force your way through this to try to go swimming or to launch your kayak or canoe or boat? It's a real problem. Some preliminary results in Traverse City indicate that the presence of this in front of people's houses decreases their property values by about 25%. So it also has the potential to have a huge economic impact as well. So, am I telling you all this to make you depressed and sad about all these invasives? No, that is definitely not my goal. My goal is to show you that we should probably start acting now before we have serious problems with these species. In Michigan, and particularly in northern Michigan, we're really lucky because we're protected by water on basically 3 sides since the state is a peninsula. And the areas to the south and north of us are also doing a great job on controlling invasives. You know, I've been to some workshops in Pennsylvania and different places where basically you have a ground layer of garlic mustard and Japanese stiltgrass and mile-a-minute vine, and then a shrub layer of the buckthorn, multiple rose, and non-native honeysuckles. And then the trees are Scotch pine and tree of heaven. Over all of that, there's a covering of kudzu and swallowworts. And I look at that and think, where do you even begin? In Michigan, we are really fortunate. We do have small populations of these species, but they're still manageable at this point in time, but we need to get started on treating them and controlling them and finding them, which is why I think this partnership with the North Country SISMA is so important. So what are things that we can do? One, we can eradicate plants that we know are invasive. We can also avoid planting plants that are known to be invasives. If you're planning on improving habitat for wildlife or maybe landscaping around your house, focusing more on the native species. It's hard to predict which non-native species are going to become invasive. Some of them, like Japanese honeysuckle, were here for 60 or 80 years before they became invasive. There was that time lag where they were adapting to the climate and the soil conditions and maybe forming relationships with those mycorrhizal fungi or different things before they were able to become invasive. And then just like with the programs to control aquatic invasive species, where you clean your equipment, clean your boots, same thing with terrestrials. Clean off your boots, the fishing gear. Clean off your boots, clean off your equipment. Frequently, where we're finding invasives are the places where people are camping. So they camped in an area that had an infestation of something, packed up their gear, brought it to the next site, put it out, and all of a sudden they basically spread the seed of those invasives to a new site. So it's very important to clean off your equipment, especially in an area that's so dependent on recreation. And then last of all, to join an organization like North Country SISMA and volunteer to keep your eyes open for these invasives. Report them to MISSN or to Vicki, and Vicki will be showing you how to use MISSN later, with the MISSN database later. The more eyes on the ground that we have, the better. So, thank you and good luck.